very good evening and a warm welcome to another episode of Law and Order brought to you by Channel I Rupavahini Corporation. And today our focus will be on a topic which matters to you and I both, the topic of equality. Equality has been a slogan for different political campaigns, for revolutions, and it is a vital component of our constitution. But how does a Sri Lankan citizen practically achieve equality? And that is our topic today in our episode. And we are more than happy to welcome Mr. Aritha Wickramasinghe, the Equality Director of I Pro Bono, to Sri Lanka Rupavahini Corporation. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Shahara. Thank you for having me.
Definitely. And now the word equality definitely is, you see it on TV, you see it being proposed in political campaigns. It's a rhetoric used by many people. But in your opinion, do you think Sri Lanka has actually given equality to its citizens?
The short answer is no. If I'm going to give a more elaborate answer, exactly you're right, the term equality, whether it's between our various ethnic groups, our religious minorities, gender and other minority groups, has often been bandied about and it has become rhetorical. But we have forgotten that the term equality is also a legal term, and within that meaning of that term is quite a moral duty and a moral right of all citizens of Sri Lanka to be treated equally and to be afforded the equal protection of the law. And that is something which unfortunately we don't see happening in practice, whether it is through legislature or whether it is through actions of the state or even with private parties. The actual application of the right to equality is something which we are missing. And
also the right to equality is a fundamental right guaranteed by our constitution itself. So in that background, do you think people actually make use of this fundamental right guaranteed to the citizens of Sri Lanka through the constitution?
Look, we have a very elaborate and on the face of it a very nice fundamental rights chapter. It guarantees us citizens all kinds of rights, not just the right to equality. We have the freedom from discrimination, freedom from torture, etc., etc. But at the end of the fundamental rights chapter, you have Article 16, which says that irrespective of whatever your rights are under the Constitution and especially under the fundamental rights chapter, if there is existing law which violates these fundamental rights, those laws take precedence over the fundamental rights of a citizen. So in some ways, I mean, this constitution was introduced in 1978. Most of our laws, which were introduced during a colonial period, which were meant to subjugate people, meant to discriminate people, still take precedence and are still enforced against citizens of this country against their right to equality. So in some ways it has made the fundamental rights chapter not worth the paper it's written on, because people are really limited in how much action they can take against violations of their rights, especially their right to equality. I was actually on the phone yesterday with some members of the Attorney General's Department discussing on why there isn't enough litigious action by Sri Lankan citizens to enforce their rights. And what they're seeing actually is also a decline in the number of persons applying to the court to enforce their rights. It's because there's only limited space which they can actually enforce their rights in.
And also, when we talk about fundamental rights, especially the right to equality, a very vital component of that is gender equality. Now, in Sri Lanka, we see a lot of women undertaking education, university education, so on and so forth. But when you look at the decision makers of the country, when you take the managements of top corporates, if you take the parliament for an example, female representation has been declining over the years and it is underrepresented to a great extent. Is there a reason why this is so, and do you propose any legal reform in order to empower women in Sri Lanka?
I mean, I can't speak on behalf of women, but I will speak as a lawyer who works in the equality space. Our legal system, our political system, our electoral system is designed in a manner which supports the patriarchal establishment. And this is a conversation I think which we'll probably have to have over hours. But if you look at it from a legislative point of view, there are so many laws which push women behind, which don't allow them the full access to being a full citizen, to exercise their rights as a citizen. If you look at it from a personal laws perspective, we have, of course, the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, which is highly discriminatory towards women. We have the Tehsa Walami regulations, which again are highly discriminatory towards women.
Particularly with regard to property.
Particularly regard to property, or actually under the Tehsa Walami code, women actually can't enter into any contract without permission of their husband. And the husband can actually dispose of a woman's property without her permission. So you have so many laws. You have also laws which prevent women from working beyond certain hours. So you have all these rules which really restrict a woman's ability to actually become a full citizen of this country. And we're seeing this in Parliament, right? You have less than 4% of parliamentarians are female. So if we claim to be a democracy, and if we are a country where about 52% of the population are female, and if at least not 50% of parliament is women, then what kind of a democracy is that, where we have men actually making decisions for the future and for the rights of women? And because there are no female representation in parliament, there are no women in decision making. If you look at our corporate bodies, most of them, less than 10% are women in senior managerial positions. You're seeing an entire decision making structure which is only looking at the interests of men. And therefore you are disenfranchising more than half your population, and you're denying them their right to equality.
And if you were to propose a legal reform, what would that be? And do you think legal reform can work, or do you propose any other mechanism to fix this?
I think legal reform is paramount, because societal reform will take a long time to come. Mindset change is a generational battle, and constitutionally women have had a right to equality for many years, but of course societally in practice there is no right to equality. I would ideally, we should be reforming all these archaic laws, but there's one simple thing which we can do to actually allow the citizenry to take their rights into their own hands and enforce them, and that is to repeal Article 16. Okay, and also repeal any provisions in our constitution which prevent citizens from challenging the constitutionality of a law. There is no point in having a constitution which says all persons are equal before the law, and all persons are entitled to the right to equality and freedom from discrimination, when they are unable to challenge laws that discriminate against them. What is the purpose of this constitution provision? It's like a decoration, right? So just repeal that provision, and let civil society, let us lawyers, let the women activists, let the persons who are disabled, let the LGBT community, let them take the further action necessary in courts to enforce their rights. But we are prevented from doing that because of these particular articles in our constitution.
And also, when we talk about gender equality in Sri Lanka, recently the government of Sri Lanka, in the recent decades rather, the government of Sri Lanka made certain positive strides towards giving equality for women. One would be the enactment of the Domestic Violence Act, and then recognition of sexual harassment as a criminal offence, so on and so forth. Do you see this as a positive change of the government, or do you think that this is too late that these changes are happening?
No, it's never too late, and I think there is an obligation on the state for the progressive realization of the rights of all persons. This is a long-term process of change. So I don't think it's too late. I think it's good that it's happening. Unfortunately, the problem is that we have a lot of laws, but the enforcement is quite terrible. We have laws against sexual harassment and harassment of women, especially in public places. But there was a recent UNFPA report which showed that 95% of women are getting sexual harassed in public transport every day. So where is the law when clearly it is not being enforced? So we have, if we look at also the World Economic Forum's Gender Equality Index, Sri Lanka in 2005, surprisingly, was ranked number 13 in the world for gender equality. At that time we've had a lot of women leadership. It was during President Chandrika's time. But when we looked at the gender equality rankings last year, we had dropped to 113. We had dropped 100 places within the span of 14 years. So, yes, we've had certain progressive legislation, but when we're looking at where we're actually being ranked in how our women are being treated, we've declined 100 places. We've got a much more worse place to live for women. And we need to ask ourselves why and how can we stop this?
Certainly. And also, I think there is also an aspect of equality which mainstream media, which do not focus on. Those are the rights of the disabled or differently abled. Sri Lanka has made certain policy decisions regarding providing access for those with difficulties. But however, are you satisfied about the current law protecting those who are disabled in Sri Lanka, and what laws can we make in the future regarding this?
Sri Lanka actually has, from a legislative point of view, a good disability rights framework. In 1996, we passed the Protection of the Rights of Persons with Disability Act. This is 23 years ago. And in that act, actually, it allows any person who's been discriminated, whether in recruitment, in their employment, or in education, based on their disability, to actually file action against a private individual for having discriminated against them in the High Court. So persons with disability have these private rights which they can enforce. And then we have the accessibility regulations, which were passed in 2006, which require that all public spaces and buildings must be accessible for persons with disabilities. Of course, again, it comes to a matter of enforcement and how much respect our institutions afford to the rule of law. And for this, we had a wonderful judgment from the Supreme Court this year in April, when there were many activists, disability rights activists, who filed to the Supreme Court saying that public institutions had violated their freedom from discrimination because they have not abided by the accessibility regulations of 2006 to adapt their buildings to be accessible. They had 3 years to do that. And the Supreme Court gave a wonderful judgment, admonishing all these public institutions, demanding they compensate the petitioners in this matter, and also requiring that all public institutions upgrade their facilities so that they become more accessible, and also obliging them to disseminate this information for all ministry secretaries to issue circulars on this obligation. So, we had a very progressive judgment from the Supreme Court to admonish institutions which were not respecting and following the law of this country.
And also along with that, we see our immediate neighbor, India, which made headlines world over regarding their protection of the rights of people with different sexual orientations and gender identities. And now when we relate this to Sri Lanka, when we compare our immediate neighbor's response with the Sri Lankan response, we see that Sri Lanka is still not even discussing regarding this issue. And certainly a large number of people who belong to these communities are being disadvantaged and being persecuted by the government itself. What is your take on this?
I mean, look, we had a Supreme Court judgment here in 2016 where 2 consenting adults were brought all the way to the Supreme Court for consensual relations in private. And the court said, this is 2016. Should it be the duty of the state to use its limited resources to police what people are doing in private? It should be no one's business. And India, our big brother neighbor, which we have generally seen as a more conservative country, has made huge strides of progression on this area. Everyone has the right to equality. Our constitution guarantees this. And the protection of the rights of LGBT people have also been recognized by our Attorney General. And the government has made very progressive statements on this. So in 2014, as well as in 2017, the government, through the Attorney General, confirmed that LGBT people, that is lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender persons, so persons of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities, are protected under the right to equality under our constitution, and that discrimination against them is also prohibited under our constitution, that they're implicitly included. And it went further to say that these laws which are being used against them should not be enforced in a manner which discriminates against them. So again, very wonderful, nice statements, from the Attorney General, the legal arm of the government, and from the government, and of course from our Supreme Court. But in practice, what is going on? In practice, we see, when we look at police records, last year about 750 persons were arrested under what's called an unnatural offense. This term unnatural itself should be challenged, right? And this is something which happened in India. One of the arguments was that, is because we share the same law, we all got it from the British, was, is there anything unnatural about same-sex consensual relations? And there is plenty of evidence that any sexuality, any sexual orientation is a part of the natural human condition, which in itself is very diverse. And the Supreme Court of India, in a very landmark and a beautiful poetic judgment, said there's nothing unnatural about it. This is natural. This is the natural order of human existence, and therefore read down that law. So I think there is possibility in Sri Lanka as well, especially following the Attorney General's statements on this. LGBT persons, where they have been discriminated, should have a right, even in a private space, to enforce their fundamental rights by going to the district court. So this is also something which doesn't really happen in Sri Lanka, or which most people are not aware, that if any of your fundamental rights under the constitution were violated by a private party, you can go to the district court to enforce your rights. But in the case of disability persons, you can go straight to the High Court to enforce your rights. But also, I think there is room here for LGBT persons to go direct to the Supreme Court to seek a different interpretation, or to declare that the manner in which this law is being enforced against them, this humiliating treatment, the loss of dignity which LGBT people have to endure because of this law, needs to be read down, and their rights need to be enforced. So there's certainly scope for it.
And certainly, law reform happens as a end result of social change and social progression, and to a certain extent social pressure upon the government to make certain changes in law. Today we see different discussions calling for better protection of women's rights. We see different fronts going and talking about rights of the disabled. We see different people talking about the rights of minority ethnic groups in Sri Lanka. However, the discussion relating to those with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities have not been discussed in the limelight, have not been discussed in mainstream media or mainstream political parties in Sri Lanka. Is there a reason behind this absence of discussion, or what must we do as a country if we want to bring this discussion to the limelight?
I think one of the reasons for the absence has been the social stigma and a certain uncertainty on the legislative front. The social stigma is really what has prevented LGBT people from coming out into the front lines and asking for their rights, and also for politicians to come out and speak out in front about it. And also this issue has always been used as a political football. If any one political party decides to speak out in favor of it, the other political parties use that to admonish them and ridicule them. Ridicule terminologies are being used to ridicule persons who support rights of LGBT people. At the same time, we've seen some progressions and positive statements being made by certain politicians. For example, we've had the JVP which recently, in a public platform, as part of their policy, said that we will not tolerate or accept discrimination against persons based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We have seen the Gender Subcommittee of Parliament, which actually comprises members of all parties of parliament who are in opposition as well as in government, which have made very progressive statements on the rights of LGBT persons. We've seen the fundamental rights chapter of the proposed new constitution, which also protects the rights of all persons, including LGBT persons. So that fundamental rights chapter again was drafted through a committee which comprised all members of parliament. So you can see that at least in private or in certain spaces and spheres, our representatives in parliament are quite progressive. But when it comes to the public space is where they are reluctant to accept that LGBT persons are entitled to the same rights as all other persons. But we're also seeing the community be more vocal and trying to be more forceful about recognizing their rights which they're entitled to. And more and more people are now coming out, they're speaking out about it. But again, you have to think that, I always try and explain this to other minority groups I work with or on gender issues, It's not criminal to be a woman, even though women are being discriminated. It's not criminal to be an ethnic minority or religious minority, even though there's discrimination against them. It is not criminal to be disabled. However, LGBT people are being treated as criminals under the law. Therefore, it is much more difficult for them to come out and to ask for their rights or to seek any form of legal redress for any other violation of their rights, because they risk exposing themselves to criminal action. And that itself means that they cannot be full citizens of Sri Lanka. It denies them full citizenship. And it is an obligation on the state and our courts and our law enforcement to ensure that all citizens of this country are entitled to their full rights and their entitlements.
Certainly. And also, for our final question, we have about 2 minutes remaining. What would be your take about promoting equality in Sri Lanka? Would it be only a legislative driven process, or what else would you propose?
Of course, it can't just be legislative. As you've seen, we have lots of very progressive laws in place which are either not being enforced or people actually not aware of them. I think there has to be an effort from the state and from civil society to make sure that the wider public knows what their rights are. That's something which is really missing. People, especially I think over the last 20, 30 years, we've had this sort of negative discourse over human rights. We sort of think this is some kind of foreign concept. But a human right is the right of me sitting here in front of you, speaking my mind, giving my opinion. That's my right of free speech. These are inherent rights coming out of the existence of being human. And most Sri Lankans need to be aware of that. And maybe that's because a lot of the discourse on human rights is not being given in a language which most people understand. A lot of these discussions are happening in the English language. Even judgments of the Supreme Court, they're in English. So they're not even translated into Sinhala or Tamil. So the vast majority of Sri Lankan citizens who cannot fully comprehend a complex judgment or a complex law, most laws are also written in English, even though the law says Sinhala is the official version. You try to find online or any source a Sinhala version of the law, you won't be able to. It's still in English, right? So everything is in English. So there's only a small percentage of this country who can understand what their rights are. So we need to make sure that these rights, these laws are available publicly and dispersed widely in the vernacular, in the Sinhala and Tamil languages. And I think if we can do that, we can have a much more informed citizenry, and it will be much more difficult for our governments and for our institutions to violate the rights of our citizenry.
Definitely. And then on that positive note, we conclude today's episode on law and order. And today's discussion was on equality and the law behind it. And certainly Sri Lanka Rupavahini Corporation is grateful to Mr. Artha Wickramasinghe for making time to present himself here at our Law and Order program. And with that, we hope to meet you again with another informative episode of Law and Order next week.